Okay, Unit 6, we're going to be looking at American imperialism as well as the First World War. You talked about both of these topics last year in your Modern Europe class, but from a European perspective. So we're going to look at these events from the American side of things. Now, just to check in terms of time, where are we on the timeline? At the end of last semester, we did the Gilded Age and the Progressives. And this time of American imperialism overlaps with that. And the presidents that we will be looking at: William McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt, William Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. Just to finish up a little bit about the progressives, the impacts of industrialization, the impacts of becoming modernized in the mid-1800s. They have had some bigger effects and ultimately will lead to industrialization. But within America, the suffrage movement grows quite a bit. We had women who were going to work in factories but still weren't given equal rights. So pushing for universal suffrage, in this case meaning all adults, not just white men, this becomes really important, especially for people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. Wyoming is the first state to give women the ability to vote, except they weren't a state. At the time, they were just a territory and still needed more citizens in order to apply for statehood. So in one sense, they are passing this law allowing women to vote, hoping that it will attract settlers to this sort of vast wasteland of the West. Another thing about the suffrage movement related to statehood is Utah. Utah was a territory, and you'll remember that the Mormons were the ones who established Utah, and Mormons believed in polygamy. Well, at the same time as the suffrage movement, polygamy becomes unpopular and unfashionable in Utah. So the territory of Utah decides to outlaw polygamy, and then it will be granted statehood. What we see with this rapid industrialization is the role of factories. I mean, the businessman really only cares about their profits. But the problem is they aren't taking into consideration the safety of the workers, the cleanliness of where the workers are working, or the cleanliness of the product being produced. And this really is shown in a book called The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. You read an excerpt about this, but it is quite gruesome. Talks about people falling into food production lines and being made into sausage, essentially. And it's incredibly gruesome. And Sinclair wrote this probably with the intention of showing the plight of the worker compared to the factory owner. So the issue of the haves and the have-nots, or the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And he probably meant this as a call to socialism. But what actually happened is people were so disgusted by this that it led to the creation of the Pure Food and Drug Act. Now, this was probably going to happen eventually, but public outcry after reading The Jungle probably sped up this process. And the Pure Food and Drug Act creates the modern FDA, or the Food and Drug Administration. And this is the government body that checks food quality and drug quality. So you will see things on vitamins or other things that you are going to consume that says this has not been FDA approved, or these claims have not been proven by the FDA, or this has been FDA approved. Or when we have sort of food contamination issues, like that can happen at Chipotle, parts of the FDA might investigate. So industrialization still having a big impact here at home, but it will cause a big impact outside of our borders as well. Now, imperialism, perhaps you will remember from sophomore year, is about a nation conquering and controlling and possibly dominating a weaker nation for various different reasons, possibly to show their military strength, in order to get economic benefits, to demonstrate political legitimacy and power, or to demonstrate the superiority of their culture. This relates to Frederick Jackson Turner. In the late 1800s, he was saying that the frontier is such a unique American idea, that it is part of the American identity to always push for something new, to find a new place, to try something different. For 100 years or more of our history, it has been a physical frontier of trying to get across the continent, what we would call manifest destiny. So here's our old friend, manifest destiny. But by the 1860s, 1870s, we now control sea to shining sea. So what happens next? We have covered this continent. What is the frontier? Is it going to be a physical frontier? Is it going to be an intellectual frontier? The first frontier, or I guess we could call it the last frontier, is Alaska, and that is its state nickname. Now, Alaska was owned by the Russians. But by the 1850s, Russia is getting into some conflict with Britain. For instance, the 1854 Crimean War. So Russia was looking to offload Alaska because they didn't want Britain to get it. They approached America, hey, would you like this territory? And in the late 1850s, early 1860s, we're kind of busy with the Civil War. But by 1867, Secretary of State William Seward is convinced that this is a good choice for America. So he engages in this sale of territory. Now it's just big, open, beautiful land. It's got great landscape, but why would we want this territory? Well, it's the seals, not because they're adorable and cute, but because they have blubber, and that is a good source of oil. And they also have fur coats, which can be very warming and be sold at expensive prices. So this alone, the natural resources, make Alaska an interesting prospect, even though many people doubt it. That's why it was called Seward's Folly. They thought it was a lark. They thought it was pointless. They thought he was crazy. But then in 1896, gold is discovered in the area of the Klondike. And so we have sort of a repeat of the California gold rush, of people rushing to get to this territory in order to make their wealth. With China, some of this will be familiar. Since the mid-1800s, European powers had, as you see there, had been splitting up China. And we had the Opium Wars in the early 1840s, with which the British completely whip the Chinese. At that point, with the unequal treaties, the British have quite a bit of unfair power, but we're going to use that to our advantage. America is granted MFN status, or Most Favored Nation status. So this allows us trade rights to China. So now that we are producing things, now that we are industrialized, we can get raw materials from China and we can sell our products to the Chinese. This is important because of that huge population. We also are involved in Japan. You might remember from your sophomore class the story of Commodore Matthew Perry and his U.S. Navy vessels painted black, or the black ships. They sail into Tokyo Harbor with the white flag, the symbol of we come in peace, and says, we want to trade with you. Japan says no, and so Matthew Perry opens fire and forces the Japanese into trade with the West. So we have a little bit of involvement with East Asia, but we might be interested in some more. But in order to make that happen, we are going to need a bigger military to protect these interests. Some people think we're going to need a bigger military to protect what is now considered our hemisphere, the Western Hemisphere. This goes back to the Monroe Doctrine. And the way that's going to happen, these ideas come from Alfred T. Mahan, a U.S. admiral, so involved in the Navy, and he wrote a book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. And he claims, his thesis is that all great nations, all great powers, had a strong navy. So therefore, if the United States wants to be a great power, it must have a strong navy. So in the 1880s, America really gears up and starts building a modern navy. And we ultimately become the third largest navy. It becomes popular for young men to join the Navy because in an industrial society, everyone's living in cities, working in factories, not particularly manly. Unlike an agrarian society, you're out on the fields, you're doing physical manual labor. Joining the Navy is a way to see the world, but also a way to demonstrate your manliness, your machismo. But this provides new challenges. If we're going to have this large, strong Navy, we need new naval bases. If we're going to be able to protect the Western Hemisphere and be able to get to the Eastern Hemisphere, particularly East Asia, we need bases. So we obtain Midway. It is a series of islands. An atoll means a series of islands that is midway between North America and Asia. In World War II, this will be important, again for refueling, but for refueling planes rather than boats. A pit stop, if you will. So America's industrialized. We need more people to sell our stuff to. We have run out of Americans to sell our stuff to. We also are going to need new things to make into products. But the problem is not all Americans think this is a wise decision. Many people are opposed to it. From a moral standpoint, people look at this and say this whole idea of empire is completely against the American vision. The idea of liberty. Well, an empire is based on power and controlling someone else. That's not American. Politically, people think, hey, we've got enough problems as it is. This is during the Gilded Age, and we have the Credit Mobilier scandal, and we have wealth inequality. We've got lots of problems in our own country. Why should we fix other places or get more problems other places? Many people fear that growing a military will be incredibly expensive. We don't want to pay those taxes that would be necessary to build a military. Also, if we have a big military, we're probably going to be tempted to use it. And if we use it, we might end up in a war. And if we end up in a war, we're probably going to have a draft. So these people feel it is not worth it to engage in this game of imperialism. There's the racial issue of imperialist racism. This idea that thinking you are better than someone else, that's why you have the authority to control them or influence them as significantly as we would like to. We also have economic opposition. Many people believe, and I would agree with them, that this idea of empire is based on greed. But we aren't going to get the benefits of empire right away. We're going to have to invest. We're going to have to spend money before we make money. So people feel like, the national debt, we have problems. We are already suffering. We are already experiencing, financial contractions. And we've had too many different financial panics in just the 19th century. So why should we make it worse? It would cause more problems than benefits.